Welcome back to the Racial Draft Podcast. I am Michael Ford, your host, as we change the complexion of the comic book universe one draft pick at a time. Sorry for a little bit of pause there. I lost my space. But I'm not joined by a guest this week. Maybe I will be joined by a guest a little bit later. But we're gonna just jump right into the racial draft business. It is the second round of our season 8 draft. That is picks number 11 through 20. And in true snake draft fashion, we start off with the delegation that picked in the 11 spot, so they would have picked in the 10th spot in the first round. That starts us off with the Polynesian delegation. And yeah, I would say that this pick was a little bit out of left field. Not a lot out of left field. Maybe a little bit early in terms of strategy wise, but I definitely understand the rationale. And that would be Oliver Queen, aka the Green Arrow. I don't know how much you, the listener, know about Oliver Queen. I mean, he had a television show for a number of seasons on the CW. He is, generally speaking, known for being politically liberal as in terms of his personality, but in terms of his powers, he's Johnson. He's an archer, and he is very much rendered in the vein of, your Robin Hood-esque dressed in green, hence Green Arrow. Occasionally a hood. He's known for his Dick Van Dyke goatee, and generally his white complexion and blonde hair. So in terms of trying to render him in the same way that he's rendered in the comics, racial drafting him does present a couple of visual, complications. So, however, daunted, the Polynesian delegation drafted him, presumably more for his character traits. I do believe that there's Star City is not necessarily a real city. That's Green Arrow's hometown, but that is often rendered in the vein of Seattle, Washington. And I think that there's a fairly sized Polynesian community there. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Racial Draft Podcast at gmail.com is the email address. You can also find us on social media, Racial Draft Pod on Twitter, and Racial Draft Pod on Blue Sky, as well as racial.draft on Instagram and Threads. But like I said, I think there's a decent sized Polynesian community in Seattle where Oliver Queen is based. And, again, he's a billionaire, he's wealthy, but he does try to look out for the little guy, hence one of his rationales for being a superhero. So on that vein, I would generally approve of the drafting, maybe not in the strongest of terms, but you know, somewhat. And as it happens, the people, the voters, the listeners, you can vote like from numerous locations, including Twitter, including Instagram and Threads, but also at RachelDraft.com, the hub, if you will, the waypoint where you can follow all of the racial draft picks and polls as they happen. You can vote in a number of places, but in the ongoing weekly poll that runs on Twitter, it's currently at 90% approval. So that's 70% strongly approve, 20% somewhat approve, and only 10% somewhat disapproving of Polynesian Oliver Queen. Moving on from Oliver to another pick that's, I wouldn't say as far out of left field as Oliver Queen, but slightly so. And that would be the Latin delegation drafting Sam Wilson. You might know him as the Falcon, but you also might know him as Captain America, who has a movie coming out in just a couple of months. He is a longtime friend and ally of Steve Rogers, longtime Harlem resident, as it were, since why he's traditionally been associated with the Black community. Obviously, there are Afro-Latinos, and I would say that in a lot of contexts, Sam Wilson being Afro-Latino could work. But, it's a little tricky. It's a little tricky. As we often discuss here in the racial draft, what we tend to really focus on when you pick for a delegation is the idea that this person identifies with the character identifies with the background, the racial background first and foremost. And I think in the case of Sam Wilson, there's so many aspects of his character that really do stick in the particularized grievances, the particularized pressures of being a black man, even more so than being either both black and Latino, or, Latino, but Afro-Latino. And I would imagine, again, given what we were talking about before, with the fact that his movie is coming out during Black History Month, that he's generally viewed as the Black Captain America, and that, he has such close ties to Wakanda, both in the comics and in live action in the MCU. I think that does create a complication for Latino Sam Wilson, even Afro-Latino Sam Wilson. It's not something that would need to be completely overcome, but it is something that has to be addressed somehow. All of that is preamble to uh, pointing out that as of now, the approval rating is dead split, 50-50. 50% approving, with 25% strongly approve and 25% somewhat approving, 12.5 somewhat disapproving, and 37.5 strongly disapproving of Afro-Latino Sam Wilson. As far as their fan cast, they did present us with a fan cast. I'll double back on Oliver Queen, because they too presented with a fan cast. Laz Alonso, who you might know from The Boys, or some of his other roles in Hollywood. He's actually been out there for a little bit. Big fan of the actor. He's also from New York. I think that, as an actor, I definitely think he could pull the role off, and that's probably why the approval rating for the casting is higher than the approval rating for the pick, and that's 80% approval rating, with 40% strongly approving and 40% somewhat approving, and only 20% strongly disapproving. So, that was Latino Sam Wilson. Like I said, I would double back to Polynesian Green Arrow, and I will do that in just a moment, because they too had a fan cast. Alex Tarrant, who, I know he's done some CBS shows as well as Rings of Power, which is what I've seen him on. He's pretty smooth and pretty debonair, and action oriented. So, I mean, I definitely think that he's someone from the Polynesian community that could embody the role of Alpha Queen. And the people tend to agree. 85.7% approval rating, with 57%, let me make sure, yep, 57% strongly approve, and 28.6 somewhat approve, with only 14.3 somewhat disapproving of this fan cast. Got a little tripped up a little bit, but I'm gonna stick with it, and continue to move forward as I discuss the next delegation. So the third pick comes from the Jewish delegation, and the Jewish delegation, I would call this mostly a defensive pick. That is Harley Quinn. You probably know her from any number of pop culture made over from the Batman animated series. You might know her from the Suicide Squad movies, where she was played by Margot Robbie. You might know her from her cartoon on Max, or you just might know her generally from Batman media. Either way, she's a popular character. One might say she's one of the most popular sort of I wouldn't say non-traditional, but newer, in the sense of the last 20 years or so, comic book characters, particularly female comic book characters. She's generally cuts across different ages and demographics, has a very distinct look, and has a very wide-ranging fan base, particularly a diverse one. So, very, very popular character, very prominent and well exposed character across different forms of media. I love the pick for the Jewish delegation. And little known fact, she is canonically Jewish in the comics. So, you, oh, you pay no attention to what's going on in the background. However, we will press ahead, and I will let you know how the people feel about this pick. As it happens, 100% approval rating for still Jewish Harley Quinn. So, can't complain on that front. Now, as for the fan cast, you might know her from, I believe she was on Community. I also know she was on Glow. Alison Brie was the fan cast for Jewish Harley Quinn. And the approval rating on that one is actually 77 77.8. So that is 37.7 with some rounding going on. 33.3, strongly approve. 44.4, somewhat approve. And 11.1, somewhat disapprove. And 11.1, strongly disapprove. So that's our approval ratings for Jewish Harley coin. Moving right along is the South Asian delegation. This is another pick that's been very prominent in comics as of late. Wanda Maximoff, who you also would know as the Scarlet Witch, obviously prominently featured on the WandaVision series, as well as the antagonist in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. She's been played by Elizabeth Olsen, although canonically in the comics she is Romani, who Romani people do have South Asian ethnicity in their background. So over time, this is something we've talked about before. Over time, how she's been depicted has definitely moved on from a very stereotypical, while still being white, representation to a lot more visibly brown. And, that's been good. That's been positive, particularly for Romani people, but it hasn't completely taken on, from the perspective of the South Asian delegation, like I mentioned before. Romani people do have generally Indian heritage somewhere in their background, although albeit mixed with undetermined other ethnic origins. But for me, I don't really have a basis for disapproving of the pick. I mean, it's even a little bit outside of the box in the sense of um, you know direct, but I think it's strong enough. I think there's enough there, particularly in terms of casting and rendering her. As I've said before, they've been rendering her and depicting her as brown. So, I think they can continue to do so uh, on behalf of the South Asian delegation. The approval rating for the pick is currently at 81. Let me make sure my math is right. 81.8%. And that would make it 63.6 strongly approve, 18.2 somewhat approve, 9.1 somewhat disapprove, and 9.1 strongly disapprove. Moving on from the fourth pick to the fifth pick, very, very, very defensive in the sense that the white delegation, our pals over there, went ahead and drafted a character that you're going to be hearing a lot of in the coming year, a lot about in the coming year as he returns. One might call him born again, and that would be Matt Murdock, aka Daredevil, aka the Blind Lawyer, aka Mr. Flippy Flippy. Listen. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that we could say about him. He's been depicted a lot in live action. He's been depicted in a couple times in animation, not very extensively, and of course he's been long standing in the comics, particularly as an ally of Spider-Man, but generally been associated with New York City. Matt Murdock, I believe, is of Irish descent in the comics, with his father Battling Jack, and while there's not too much in his story that makes him such that he has to be white, which is why he's been drafted by other delegations in the past. Obviously, this is how he's been traditionally depicted, particularly with respect to his red hair, which, ironically, even though there are certain people who fight so hard for redhead representation, not depicted on Netflix or in the MCU with red hair, despite being depicted as white. Funny how that works. Sticking with the fan cast, Charlie Cox, who has played him across the Netflix and as well as MCU, they're sticking with that fan cast. So in terms of the approval, give me a second, guys. Trying to get the math right on this. 62.5% approval rating for still white Matt Murdock. That is a lot lower than I was expecting. However, 100% approval rating and all strongly approve of Charlie Cox's depiction of Matt Murdock. But I'll double back. It's only 50% strongly approve of Matt Murdock staying white, and 12.5 somewhat approve of that. 25% somewhat disapprove of white Matt Murdock, and 12.5 strong disapprove of white Matt Murdock. Yeah, that was a shocker for me too. I know. But I should have mentioned, or I will mention yet again, that you can continue to cast your votes for these picks. By the time this podcast is up, maybe one or two of our polls would have closed on Twitter, but most of them will still be open. And like I said, you can also cast your vote on the website, racialdraft.com, which, as I mentioned last week, these polls on the website on racialdraft.com are going to run for the whole season. So you will have time, to kind of really think through how you think these characters should be. And my understanding is that you can change your vote after you've cast it. But you cannot cast multiple votes. Moving on from that, one traditionally white character to another traditionally white character, but this one is actually having his ethnicity changed, and that would be Hal Jordan, Green Lantern. One thing about Hal Jordan that we should mention is that, he's not necessarily the first ever character to be named Green Lantern, but definitely the first Green Lantern to be associated with the Green Lantern Corps. He's very much the standard issue, if you will, Green Lantern. He still has a storyline behind him. He was a fighter pilot who fell into the ring of trying to remember the name of the Green Lantern who preceded him, but he dies. And he finds the alien, and the ring chooses him. And one might argue, many have argued, that he's been the greatest Green Lantern of all time. And he's had a number of feats, as people in comics like to say, but he's also gone bad. He's also, he's ran the gamut over the decades of being both heroic and, letting things down. We know that there's going to be a Lanterns HBO Max series, or Lantern Max series, that is going to air on HBO. And we know that he's going to be played by Kyle Chandler, who you might know from Friday Night Lights, will be playing Hal Jordan, an older Hal Jordan, mind you, and he will be mentoring a younger John Stewart. But yeah, so I should have mentioned it was the Southeast Asian delegation went ahead and drafted Hal Jordan. And, honestly, even though there are a number of traditional, like I said before, he's been traditionally depicted as a white man. He hasn't been depicted in any other way. There's really nothing to his character, with the exception of, being forgiven for his sins, that, makes it so that he's particularly has to be a white man. So, for that reason, I really don't have any cause to not approve of this pick, any real reservations against the pick. And the people tend to agree with me. 85.7% approval rating, with all 85.7 strongly approving of East Asian Hal Jordan. I say East Asian Hal Jordan because they provided us with a fan cast. John Cho, who you might know from the Star Trek movies, or Harold and Kumar, or any number of other acting appearances. Great actor, believable. I think believable as a law enforcement agent. He also was 85.7% approval rating, but 71.4 strongly approve and 14.3 somewhat approve, and only 14.3 disapproving, but that disapproving strongly disapproving, which I think is racist. Moving on from the racism, though, is something that very, very popular character. It's kind of ironic that we lost the poster, but it's Miles Morales from the multiracial delegation. You might know him from the Spider-Verse movies. You might know him as the Black Spider-Man, but he's not just the Black Spider-Man. He's also the Puerto Rican Spider-Man. And it's been important, I think, in recent years, that in addition to being still depicted with his dark skin, the other aspects of his culture as a young kid from Brooklyn, both Black and Puerto Rican, I think that live action not live action, I think that movies and comics have done their part to really highlight the multi-ethnic background of Miles Morales. And I would like to see that continue. And additionally, the multiracial delegation would also like to see that continue. But shockingly, only 50% approval rating for canonically multiracial Miles Morales. So if that's how you feel, go ahead and make your voice known. I was like, I'm dumbfounded finding out that The people disapprove, or at least don't strongly approve, of Miles Morales remaining both black and Latino. No fan cast there, so we'll move on. One somewhat defensive pick to another, the Swana MENA delegation. You know, I've mentioned this before, precious few canonically Middle Eastern characters in the comic book world, particularly on the Euro side. And they went ahead and drafted one of the more prominent ones. That would be Damian Wayne, aka Damian Al Ghul, aka Talia al Ghul's son, aka Batman's son, aka he's brown. Um, but yeah, Damian Wayne, he's also going to be featured at some point in live action as part of this Batman Brave and the Bold film. We haven't heard a lot about the movie, but we know it's coming. We also know that he's been depicted on the Harley Quinn cartoon. He was also depicted in the Merry Little Batman animated short or something or other. But yeah, he's Batman's son, and he is of Middle Eastern descent. And, obviously, with the world of DC not always mirroring the real world, we're not exactly sure what country the Al Ghuls are from. They're kind of vaguely, but he has been known, Damien has been known to spend a lot of time in Lebanese communities. I don't know if that means specifically Lebanese, but it does mean he has an affinity. And in terms of approval, a little bit lower than I would have liked. 0.3, sorry, 83.3 approval rating, 66.6 strongly approve, and 16.7 somewhat approve, and 16.7 somewhat disapprove of Swana, Mena, Robin, aka Damian Wayne. That brings us to the ninth, the penultimate pick of the round. A lot later than I would have expected. And this one's going to be, I think, a tricky square to circle, or tricky circle to square. Yeah, let's do that. That is Steve Rogers, aka Captain America. Now, I know what you're thinking. Captain America's he's a white man, and traditionally he has been blonde-haired, blue-eyed, almost Ubermenchian Nazi ideal, one might say. And of course, we've seen the Hydra Steve affiliated with Nazi adjacent Hydra. We've seen the evil Steve, who's supposed to be a doppelganger of the Steve Rogers from our universe. However, we do know that is a creation of Jewish creators, and we know that there's definitely a lot in his story that sort of tie in to the experience, perhaps not the experience of a person of color per se, but there's a little bit of reckoning with privilege that happens with Steve Rogers. And I think that if in a world where Steve Rogers could potentially pass as white, obviously he would, even if he were not actually white. And there is room for a story to be told whereby a Native American Steve Rogers does everything that he can to pass as white until he returns in the present day and somewhat outs himself as not white. I think that that's a lane that could exist whereby Steve can still have the origin and the backstory that he has and occupy the role that he occupies as a propaganda figure for the war, while reckoning with, what it means to be Captain America while being Native American, and knowing that you may stand for one kind of freedom and one kind of patriotic ideal, but you also stand for, if not a full, definitely a near genocide. It adds layers to the characters, gives Steve yet another thing to aspire towards in his goal of being better, aspirational for America rather than just representational. So for that reason, I wouldn't say I disapprove of the pick, even though it is a little controversial and a little difficult to square. The people generally on my side, 85.8 rounding, let's say, the percent approval rating for Native American Steve Rogers, 42.9 strongly approve, 42.9 somewhat approve, 0% somewhat disapprove, and 14.3 strongly disapprove of Native American Steve Rogers. That brings us to the final pick of the round, and you'll get no argument from me about this pick because it is right down the middle. And by right down the middle, I mean right down the middle of Wakanda with some vibranium, and that is T'Challa, the Black Panther, the Black Panther. Yeah, I mean, what else can be said? Black people love Wakanda. Black people love Black Panther. Black people love the idea of a world, a city, a country untouched by colonial forces and untouched by oppression, allowed to reach the highest mountaintop of Black excellence. And their hero, finally, after centuries of seeing oppressed people being oppressed, well, not himself, but his country staying hidden from the world, while particularly Black people, but all marginalized people have been put under the boot of oppressors and colonizers. The Black Panther ushers his utopian world out into the outside world, and brings his brand of excellence to bear. Obviously, he's a complicated figure in terms he's not all good and not all benevolent. There are a lot of things that you have to do in order to remain a king, and he does a lot of those things and has to pay consequences for them. But characters like those are qualities like those are what makes characters like T'Challa compelling. And we don't have to get into all of the machinations about the uh, movement in the wake of Chadwick Boseman's unfortunate passing. This character exists in more than just the MCU. And, we continue to honor the performance of Chadwick Boseman and how he brought the character to life three-dimensionally and made him bigger than he was ever before that. All that is to say that fine pick for the Black delegation gets the highest levels of approval in my book, which is why it's disappointing to find out that the voters have only voted 85% approval. With all 85.7 strongly approving, it's still a lot less approving as it should be. So whoever's out there in the 14.3 that strongly disapproving, shame on you. So that was it. Those are the 10 picks in the round of the racial draft, second round. I thought we might get a guest in here to talk about the picks, so you wouldn't just have to hear me pontificating for however long I was doing that. But maybe next week, we'll get into some of the stories as well that broke over the last week. No sense in again, you just hear me pontificate and give my opinions about them. We'll leave it there. Listeners, hopefully you can find us in all the places that you find podcasts. We're also on YouTube, so if you want to look at my face, I don't know why you want to do that, but if you'd like to, I'm also on YouTube. Like, subscribe, do all that cool stuff on YouTube where you can see some of our YouTube exclusive content. You can also find us on TikTok. I didn't mention before that, yeah, but Racial Draft is also on TikTok. Racial Draft podcast on Twitter and Blue Sky. We're doing the Blue Sky thing. We're doing it. And of course, Instagram and Threads. Hopefully you enjoyed the little abbreviated trip down Racial Draft Lane. Until next time, all things are possible.